Grace, thank you for everything. You were the true heart of this family. Please forgive my son. The Filipino tycoon fired the African housekeeper. Then his late mother's final video changed everything. She scrubbed his floors for 3 years and never once raised her voice. He fired her in front of the whole household without blinking. Then his dead mother's final video called her daughter, and the most powerful man in Manila learned that the woman he just destroyed had been the one keeping him alive. Hit subscribe if you believe people deserve the truth before the verdict. Aunt Ruth judged Thandi in seconds without proof, without mercy. And she's not the only one in this family capable of that cruelty. The main hall of the Tiongson estate had seen weddings, funerals, and one memorable shouting match in 2020 that nobody discussed at holidays. It had never seen anything quite like this. A grown man about to torch his own house down out of grief dressed up as certainty. Raphael Tiongson stood at the center of it in a barong that cost more than most people's cars. Arms folded, jaw set in the particular way that made underlings suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. 31 years old, and already fluent in the language men speak when they don't want to be questioned. Silence, stillness, the occasional raised eyebrow that landed like a verdict. Behind him, arranged like a jury that had already decided the case over Merienda, stood the relatives. Aunt Ruth dabbed at eyes that had been suspiciously dry through the entire funeral 3 weeks earlier, but had found sudden moisture the moment inheritance paperwork entered the conversation. Uncle Bayani stood with his hands clasped, wearing the solemn expression of a man who'd rehearsed it in a mirror. And in the corner, quiet as she'd been for 3 years, stood Thandiwe Okafor. Hands folded in front of her, spine straight, eyes forward. She did not look like a woman about to be destroyed. She looked like a woman who had already made peace with it. "The documents were in your mother's private office," Raphael said, and his voice came out flatter than he intended, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Access required a key. You had one." "I had one. I had one because I cleaned the room, Mr. Tiongson." Thandi's voice was steady, not pleading, just stating a fact the way you'd correct someone's math. So did 3 other people. None of them stood to gain anything from a leaked buyout. Neither did I. Aunt Ruth made a small sound in her throat, the auditory equivalent of "I told you so," and Raphael's jaw tightened another half-inch. Grief has a gravity to it. It pulls logic down into its orbit and calls the wreckage closure. He had buried his mother 3 weeks ago and hadn't cried once, not because he didn't feel it, but because feeling it meant admitting how much of his spine she'd been holding up. Anger was easier. Anger had a target. "You're dismissed," he said, effective immediately. "Don't come back." The room held its breath, waiting for a scene, waiting for tears, for begging for the kind of collapse that would make the verdict feel earned. Thandi simply nodded, once slow like someone confirming a weather forecast they'd already suspected. Then she turned and walked toward the staircase, footsteps unhurried on marble floors she'd polished on her knees more mornings than she could count. She didn't cry until she reached her room, and even then quietly into a towel, so the walls wouldn't carry it downstairs. 3 years is a strange unit of time to disappear inside a house. Long enough to learn which step on the second-floor landing creaked, which of the Tiongson cousins snuck cigarettes on the West Terrace, which nights Aling Grace couldn't sleep and wanted someone. Anyone sitting quietly beside her, while the television murmured old teleseries neither of them watched. Long enough to become furniture. Reliable, unremarkable, moved around a room without anyone asking its opinion. Thandi packed fast. There wasn't much to pack. A duffel bag, half empty, holding the sum total of a life folded into cotton and thread. She didn't take the small pearl bracelet Aling Grace had given her 2 Christmases ago. Too easy to accuse her of stealing that too. She left it folded inside a drawer with a note that said only, "Thank you for the rainy seasons." She was halfway down the back stairwell, bag over one shoulder, when the front hall erupted into a different kind of silence than the one she'd left behind. The family lawyer, a man named Addy Domingo, who had represented 3 generations of Tiongsons and buried his own opinions about most of them decades ago, arrived without an appointment, which in that house was the social equivalent of walking in with a lit match. He carried a single envelope, cream-colored edges gone soft and yellow with age, sealed in wax that had cracked slightly with time. On the front, in handwriting every person in that room would have recognized blindfolded, was a single line: "To be opened only if Thandi is ever forced to leave this house." Aunt Ruth's rehearsed grief evaporated on contact with real confusion. "What is that?" "Instructions," Domingo said simply. From a woman who apparently trusted very few people in this room to do the right thing without proof. Raphael felt something cold move through his chest, quiet and certain like the first crack forming in ice a half-second before the whole lake gives way. "Open it," he said. Domingo did. Inside. Domingo did. Inside, nestled in tissue paper gone brittle with age, was a small flash drive and a second, shorter note, this one written in a shakier hand, clearly added closer to the end. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and someone in this family has done something they cannot undo. Play the video in the office, all of you, especially you, Raphael." He should have felt relief. Instead, his stomach dropped the particular way it does right before a car accident you can see coming but can't stop. That horrible half-second of clarity where you already know on some animal level that whatever comes next is going to rewrite you. "Everyone," he said, voice quieter than it had been all morning, "to the office." Behind him on the stairs, Thandi had stopped walking. She hadn't moved to leave, not yet. Because some part of her, some tired 3 years quiet part, already knew exactly what was on that drive. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the Tiongson estate, she was afraid. The office still smelled like her. Jasmine and old paper, a scent Raphael hadn't noticed until it was the only thing left of his mother in a room built to hold everything else about her. The household filed in behind him like mourners arriving late to their own funeral. Aunt Ruth found a chair near the window and sat down hard, fanning herself with a hand that trembled slightly now, the performance draining out of her real time. Uncle Bayani stood near the bookshelves, arms crossed, jaw working like a man chewing on a fat he didn't want to swallow. Domingo set the laptop on the desk, plugged in the drive and stepped back, the careful distance of a man who delivered bad news for 40 years and had learned exactly how far to stand from the blast radius. Raphael sat in his mother's chair. It still held the shape of her. The video opened on a woman none of them fully recognized. Not because her face had changed, but because grief rewrites memory faster than illness rewrites a body. Alan Grace looked thin. Paper thin. The kind of thin that made jewelry look like it belonged to someone else. But her eyes were exactly the same. Sharp enough to cut through a boardroom of men twice her size. Sharp enough now to make her own son sit up straighter in a chair that used to be hers. "If you're watching this," she said, her voice trembling but never once breaking, "then someone in this family has done something unforgivable." A pause. The kind of pause that makes a room forget how to breathe. "Protect my daughter." Silence has weight. Everyone who has ever sat in a room after devastating news knows this. The way it presses down on shoulders. The way it makes even breathing feel like an intrusion. This particular silence lasted 4 full seconds, which is a very long time when no one in a room is certain they're still standing on solid ground. "Daughter?" Aunt Ruth repeated. And for once in her life, the word came out of her without theater, without performance. Just raw, unrehearsed confusion. "She doesn't have a daughter. She has him." She gestured at Raphael like he was evidence in a trial suddenly gone sideways. On the screen, Alan Grace continued. And the story she told wasn't the one anyone had expected. Not a scandal, not an affair, not the tabloid fodder the family had spent years bracing against. It was older than that, quieter. 27 years old, in fact. She spoke of a mission trip to Rwanda in her 20s, relief work in a refugee camp, before the Tiongson Empire had swallowed her whole and left no room for anything as inconvenient as compassion. She spoke of a crisis in the camp, of 2 parents who died shielding strangers who weren't even their own, and of an infant left with no one. "I couldn't leave her," Ellen Grace said, and here her composure finally cracked, just slightly, just enough. "I told myself it was one act of mercy. It became the truth of my whole life." Powerful men back then, men whose names still meant something dangerous in certain rooms, had made it clear that an adopted daughter from a refugee camp would be a liability, a weakness, a thread someone could pull to unravel everything Alan Grace had built. So, she'd hidden it. Buried it under decades of silence, distance, and one impossible arrangement. Bring the girl home, but never as a daughter. As help, as furniture, as someone the family could overlook without ever suspecting what she truly was. Raphael's hands resting on the desk had gone very still. "Thandi," he said, and the name came out of him differently than it had an hour ago. Smaller, disbelieving like a word he'd never actually learned the meaning of until this exact second. Behind him, at the office door, a shadow moved. Thandi stood in the doorway, duffel bag still over one shoulder, face unreadable in the low light. She hadn't come in. She hadn't needed to. She'd heard enough from the hallway to know that the life she'd spent 3 years quietly surviving had just detonated behind her in a room full of people who'd never once bothered to look at her twice. Aunt Ruth turned first, then Uncle Bayani, then slowest of all Raphael, the man who'd fired her an hour ago with the flat certainty of a closing ledger, now looking at her the way you look at something you've broken and only just realized was priceless. "You knew," he said, not a question. "I knew," Thandi said quietly, "that your mother loved you enough to keep me a secret so you'd never have to share your inheritance with a stranger from a refugee camp. I knew that better than any of you ever bothered to ask." She turned to go, truly go this time, bag over her shoulder. Nothing left to pack, nothing left to prove. Wait. Raphael was on his feet before he decided to be. The video isn't finished. On the screen behind him, his mother's face lingered on one final frame, one final sentence typed in careful subtitle beneath her trembling voice. Words that hadn't played yet, words that would turn every accusation in that room to ash. "There is one more thing you all need to know about what she's done for this family." Thandi stopped in the doorway. She hadn't expected that part to be recorded, too. The subtitle hung on the screen like a held breath, and for a moment nobody in that office moved to unpause it. Not because they didn't want to know, because some part of every person in that room understood instinctively that whatever came next would finish rearranging furniture that had already been knocked over once today. Raphael looked at Thandi, still frozen in the doorway. "Stay," he said. It wasn't an order this time. It came out closer to a request, which was a language he hadn't used with staff in years, possibly ever. She didn't sit. She didn't come closer, but she stayed. Arms crossed over the duffel bag strap like it was the only thing keeping her upright, and gave the smallest nod toward the laptop. "Play it." Domingo, still standing near the desk with the particular stillness of a man who'd clearly known more than he'd let on for years, reached over and pressed play. Alan Grace's voice returned, weaker now. The recording clearly made in the final stretch of her illness, when even sitting upright for the camera must have cost her something. "3 years ago," she said, "I brought my daughter into this house under a lie, because I was a coward who valued the family name more than the truth. I told myself I was protecting her. I understand now I was protecting myself." A pause, a breath that rattled slightly on the recording. But she never once let that lie define what she did for us. The screen shifted to a series of documents Domingo began pulling up alongside the video. Bank transfers, encrypted messages, a paper trail assembled with the meticulous patience of someone who'd clearly spent months building a case nobody had asked her to build. 18 months ago, Alan Grace continued, a rival conglomerate attempted a hostile buyout of Tiongson Holdings disguised as a routine restructuring proposal. Our board very nearly approved it. It was blocked at the final hour by an anonymous shareholder alert that traced back to an account no one in this family recognized. Domingo glanced up. It traced back to her. Aunt Ruth's mouth opened, and then closed again like a woman trying to argue with a mathematical proof. The video continued, and Raphael felt his pulse doing something strange and irregular. The way it does right before you understand a truth your body has already accepted faster than your mind. 14 months ago, his mother's recorded voice said, my son was the target of a shooting outside a hotel in Makati. He survived because he received a transfusion of an extremely rare blood type in time. The hospital never disclosed where the emergency donor match came from. I know where it came from. Raphael's head turned slow, disbelieving toward the woman in the doorway. He remembered that night with a clarity that suddenly felt insulting in its incompleteness. The white ceiling tiles of the recovery room, the blur of faces, his mother gripping his hand so hard it left marks, and somewhere in the chaos a nurse mentioning an anonymous donor who'd arrived within the hour, matched and left before anyone could get a name. That was you, he said. Thandi said nothing. Her jaw was tight, her eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. The posture of someone who had spent years learning how to survive being seen and never quite unlearned the instinct. And 6 months ago, Alan Grace's voice finished, quieter now, nearly a whisper, a rival conglomerate offered her an enormous sum, more money than I ever paid her in 3 years combined, for insider information on this family's security, our schedules, our vulnerabilities. She turned it down. She didn't tell me until I found the recorded call myself, going through her old phone records after I fell ill, terrified I wouldn't survive long enough to protect her the way she'd protected all of you." The video ended on Alan Grace's face, tired and resolute, delivering one final line that Raphael would replay in his head for the rest of his life. "She never asked for gratitude. She never asked for anything. I am asking you, all of you, to be better than the family that made that necessary." The screen went black. For a long moment, no one in the office spoke. Aunt Ruth had gone the color of old parchment. Uncle Bayani was staring at his own shoes as if they'd personally betrayed him. Raphael stood slowly and crossed the room toward Thandi, the woman he'd humiliated in front of the entire household not 2 hours earlier. The woman who'd bled for his survival without ever expecting so much as a thank you. "Why?" he said, voice cracking in a way he would have found unbearable from anyone else. "Did you let me fire you? You could have said something. Any of it, all of it." Thandi finally met his eyes, and there was no triumph in her expression, no vindication, only exhaustion and something close to grief. "Because your mother asked me never to use the truth as leverage," she said. "Not even to save myself, especially not to save myself." She adjusted the bag on her shoulder, the same bag she'd packed hours ago, believing her life in that house was over. "I kept my promise," she said. "Question is whether this family is capable of keeping hers." She turned toward the door. This time, nobody moved to stop her. Not because they didn't want to, but because for the first time in 3 years, every person in that room finally understood exactly who they'd be losing if they let her walk out of it. Outside, a car engine started in the courtyard, not hers. Someone else had just arrived, and whoever it was, Domingo's face had gone pale the moment he heard it. The engine cut off in the courtyard, and Domingo's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, the gesture of a man checking whether the call he'd been dreading had finally answered itself. "Who is that?" Raphael asked, already moving toward the window. "That," Domingo said, voice tight, "is a problem I was hoping your mother's video would make unnecessary." Through the office window, Raphael watched 2 black SUVs pull to a stop on the gravel. Doors opening in that unhurried, choreographed way that only ever meant one thing in his world. People who didn't need to rush because they already believed they held every card. A man stepped out first, mid-50s, silver-templed, dressed in the kind of understated tailoring that cost more than the loud kind. Raphael recognized him immediately, the way you recognize a wound you thought had healed. "Datu Reyes," he said flatly. Aunt Ruth made a small, strangled sound. "Of Reyes Lim Conglomerate? What is he doing here?" "Cleaning up," Thandi said quietly from the doorway, and something in her tone made every head in the room turn toward her again. She hadn't left after all. Some instinct, maybe the same one that had made her intercept a hostile buyout 18 months ago, had kept her rooted in place the moment she heard tires on gravel. "You know him?" Raphael asked. "I know what he wants," she said. "He's the one who tried to buy me 18 months ago and 6 months ago. When I said no both times, he made it clear there'd be a third visit eventually." Domingo's jaw tightened. "There's more, Raphael. Sit down." "I've been sitting down for the worst news of my life for the last hour," Raphael said. "I'll stand." Domingo exhaled, the particular exhale of a lawyer about to detonate the last piece of a case he'd been protecting for years. The forged shares Datu Reyes's people have been quietly acquiring. They weren't forged by outsiders. They were signed over gradually over the last 2 years by someone inside this family. Someone with legal access to your mother's holdings while she was still alive, but too ill to review paperwork carefully. The room's attention shifted, slow and heavy like a tide finding a new direction. Uncle Bayani's shoes, which he'd been staring at with such devotion moments earlier, suddenly seemed far less interesting to him than the exits. "Bayani," Raphael said, and the name came out of him like a blade sliding free of its sheath. "I don't know what he's talking about," Bayani said too fast, the words tripping over each other in a way that confirmed everything faster than any confession could have. "Your mother suspected," Domingo said, ignoring him entirely, turning back to Raphael. "That's why she built the file. Not just to protect Thandi's identity, to build a case against whoever was slowly bleeding this company dry while everyone was distracted mourning her decline. She just ran out of time to finish it." Outside, Datu Reyes had reached the front steps, flanked by 2 men whose suits fit a little too well to be simple assistants. He knocked once, a courtesy nothing more, before letting himself into the foyer with the ease of a man who'd been assured by somebody that he'd be welcome. "Raphael Tiongson," he called out, voice carrying down the hallway with practiced warmth, the kind reserved for people you're about to ruin politely. My condolences on your mother. I understand this is a difficult week to discuss business, but I'm afraid the timeline on our proposal doesn't bend for grief. Raphael stepped into the hallway to meet him, and for the first time since the video began, some of the old coldness returned to his face. Not the coldness of a grieving man lashing out at the nearest target, but the coldness of a man who finally understood exactly where the real threat had been standing all along. There is no proposal, Raphael said. Datu Reyes smiled, unbothered. There will be once your board sees how thin your family's unity really is. Forged shares have a funny way of making themselves legitimate when the people who signed them refuse to contest it publicly. His eyes drifted past Raphael, landing on Thandi with a flicker of recognition that turned instantly calculating. Ah, there's our girl. Reconsidered my offer yet? She's not your girl, Raphael said, and she's not for sale. Everyone's for sale, Mr. Tiongson. Your family's just never been honest about the price. Datu Reyes's gaze slid toward Uncle Bayani, who had gone the color of wet paper. Some more than others. Thandi stepped forward then, out of the doorway, out of the shadows she'd spent 3 years learning to disappear into. Tell them what you told me 6 months ago. Tell them the offer you made, and tell them why I said no. Datu Reyes's smile faltered for the first time. You recorded that call, didn't you? He said slowly. Your mother did, Thandi said, looking at Raphael. She recorded everything. She just never lived long enough to use it. Domingo stepped forward, laptop already open, a second file pulled up beside the first, audio timestamp damning. I think, Domingo said, we should discuss exactly who forged what in front of the board with all of this evidence present. Today, if Datu Reyes insists on timelines. For the first time since he'd walked through the door like a man collecting a debt, Datu Reyes looked like a man calculating an exit instead. And Uncle Bayani, silent until now, finally spoke. 3 words that would unravel the rest of the family faster than any video ever could. I want a lawyer. 3 words, and the room's temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I want a lawyer. Not I'm innocent. Not this is a misunderstanding. Just the reflexive instinct of a guilty man reaching for the only shield left available to him, which told everyone in that hallway everything they needed to know before Domingo had even opened his mouth to respond. You have one, Domingo said evenly. Me. I've represented this family for 30 years, Bayani, which means I've watched you grow up, get married, bury your own father in this very courtyard. And it means I know exactly what your handwriting looks like on a legal document. So does the forensics expert I hired 8 months ago at your sister-in-law's request when she started noticing discrepancies in the holdings ledger. Aunt Ruth's head snapped toward Domingo. She knew? She knew and didn't tell me? She didn't tell anyone, Domingo said, because she didn't know who she could trust in this house anymore. Turns out that instinct was correct. Datu Reyes, sensing the ground shifting beneath a deal that had taken 2 years to engineer, took a measured step back toward the door. The practiced retreat of a predator calculating whether the prey was actually worth the exposure. This is a family matter, he said smoothly. I have no interest in... You have every interest, Raphael cut in, and his voice had lost the flat ledger closing tone from that morning. What replaced it was something sharper, something that made even Datu Reyes's polished composure flicker. You've spent 2 years quietly buying forged shares from a man desperate enough to steal from his own dying sister-in-law. That's not a business proposal, Datu Reyes. That's a paper trail leading straight to a fraud case with your name at the top of it. Allegations, Reyes said, but the word came out thinner than he intended. Recordings, Thandi said quietly. Documents, bank transfers, your own voice on a call offering me money for insider access 6 months ago, word for word. Ellen Grace built the entire case before she died. She just needed someone in this room to finally believe her enough to use it. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Not shock this time, but calculation. The sound of several people in one hallway simultaneously recalculating how much worse their day was about to get. Bayani broke first, the way weak men always do, not with confession but with blame. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he said, voice climbing toward something close to panic. I needed the money for the restaurant chain, and Reyes's people said it was just a temporary transfer of voting shares that no one would even notice until... Until my mother was too weak to stop you. Raphael finished for him. And when she got suspicious anyway, her health started declining faster than her doctors could explain. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken until now monstrous once spoken aloud. Bayani's face went from panic to something closer to horror. I would never touch her medication, Raphael. I swear on my own children. Then who did? Domingo said quietly. Because her cardiologist flagged irregular dosing patterns 4 months before she died, and nobody investigated it because everyone assumed it was simply her illness progressing naturally. Every eye in the hallway turned almost in unison toward Datu Reyes, the one person present with both motive and the resources to make an old woman's decline look like nothing more than bad luck. Reyes's smile had entirely disappeared now, replaced by the flat assessing expression of a man deciding how quickly he could leave a building without it looking like he was running. I think, he said, this conversation is finished. It's not, Raphael said, stepping directly into his path close enough now that the two men were nearly chest to chest, one raised in boardrooms, the other raised in a house that had just spent an afternoon rediscovering what family actually meant. You tried to buy my sister. You funded the theft of my mother's company. And now there's a very real question about whether you had a hand in her death. You're not walking out of here until the police do. Somewhere behind them, sirens faint at first, then unmistakable, began cutting through the quiet of the estate's private road, growing louder with every second. Domingo allowed himself, for the first time all day, the ghost of a smile. I may have made a call, he said, the moment I saw those civis pull into the courtyard. Your mother always did say I should trust my instincts more. Datu Reyes's men, sensing the shift, exchanged a look, and quietly began drifting toward the door themselves. The unspoken language of hired muscle recognizing when a job has stopped paying enough to be worth the consequences. Aunt Ruth, meanwhile, had turned to stare at Thandi with an expression that had traveled in the space of one impossible afternoon, from contempt to confusion to something that almost resembled shame. All this time, she said quietly, we treated you like you were the danger in this house. Thandi met her eyes, steady, unflinching, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the packed bag still hanging from her shoulder. The danger, she said, was never me. Outside, the first police car turned into the courtyard, headlights sweeping across the gravel, across Datu Reyes's frozen expression, across a family standing in the wreckage of everything they'd assumed they understood about each other, and about the quiet woman they'd nearly let walk out the door forever. The police interviews took most of the afternoon, conducted in the same office where Alan Grace's face had delivered her final verdict on her own family. Datu Reyes was escorted out first, composure cracking at last under the weight of questions he couldn't smooth-talk his way around. Questions about falsified board signatures, about a private line to Bayani's phone with 18 months of call records, about a cardiologist's flagged report that suddenly had detectives asking very specific questions about medication timelines. Bayani didn't resist when they came for him. He simply stood, smoothed his jacket out of habit, and looked at his sister-in-law's portrait on the office wall like a man finally facing something he'd been avoiding his whole life. Tell Raphael, he said to no one in particular, that I never meant for her to get sick. I just wanted the money before anyone noticed. Nobody answered him. There wasn't an answer generous enough to give. By the time the last car pulled out of the courtyard, the light outside had shifted to the deep gold of late afternoon, the kind that made even a house full of wreckage look briefly beautiful. Raphael stood at the window a long time watching gravel dust settle before he realized the hallway behind him had gone quiet in a different way. Thandi was gone. Not arrested, gone. Not escorted, gone. Simply gone the way she disappeared through that house for 3 years. Quiet, unbothered, impossible to catch unless she wanted to be caught. She left 20 minutes ago, Domingo said, appearing in the doorway with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he suspected wouldn't be well received. Called a taxi herself. Said she still had a flight to catch. A flight? Raphael repeated. To where? Kigali, Domingo said. Turns out she booked it this morning before any of this happened. Before the video, before Datu Reyes, before any of us knew who she really was to this family. He paused. She wasn't running from an accusation, Raphael. She was finally leaving a house that had never once in 3 years made her feel like she belonged in it. Something in Raphael's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fraud investigations or forged shares. How long until the flight? Domingo checked his watch. 90 minutes. If you leave now with traffic, you might make it. Might? Raphael was already moving. Coat forgotten over the back of a chair. Keys snatched from the entryway table with the kind of urgency he usually reserved for hostile buyouts and midnight calls from lawyers. Aunt Ruth caught his arm at the door. Her earlier venom entirely drained out of her, replaced by something that looked almost like fear of being left behind in her own reckoning. "What do we say to her?" she asked. "If you find her?" "The truth," Raphael said, "which is more than any of us gave her in 3 years." The drive to Naya was the longest 90 minutes of his life, made longer by every red light that seemed engineered personally to test him. Every slow jeepney that pulled in front of him like the universe running one last cruelty check on a man who'd spent a lifetime avoiding vulnerability. He thought, somewhere around the 10th minute, about his mother's face on that recording. Thin, tired, still sharp enough to see through decades of silence and deliver one final instruction to a son she knew would need it. Protect my daughter. He hadn't protected her. He'd fired her. Publicly, coldly, without a single question that might have complicated his convenient verdict. He thought about the blood transfusion that had saved his life without his knowledge, about a hostile buyout blocked by an anonymous account that turned out to belong to the quietest person in his household, about 3 years of small kindnesses he'd walked past without noticing. Coffee left at his office door on late nights, a jacket draped over his shoulders once when he'd fallen asleep at his desk. Small mercies performed by a woman who'd never once asked to be seen for them. By the time he reached the terminal, sprinting past a security guard who clearly recognized the Tiongson name from every business channel in the country and decided not to stop him, the departures board showed her flight boarding in 11 minutes. He found her at gate 22, duffel bag over her shoulder, boarding pass in hand, standing in a line of strangers who had no idea they were standing next to a woman who'd quietly kept an empire from collapsing more than once. Tandy. She turned, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The noise of the terminal rushing around them like water around two stones that had finally stopped avoiding each other. "You made good time," she said finally, and there was no anger in it, which somehow felt worse than if there had been. "I came to apologize," Raphael said, properly. "Not through a video, not through a lawyer. From me." "You don't owe me an apology, Raphael." Her voice was tired, not cold, just spent. The exhaustion of someone who'd spent years being strong for people who'd never once asked if she needed to be. "You owe yourself an honest look at how easy it was to believe the worst about the one person in that house who never gave you a reason to." "Then let me start there," he said. "I believed the worst because it was easier than admitting I didn't actually know you at all. 27 years, and I never asked a single real question about who raised you. What you'd survived, what you wanted out of a life that made you scrub floors instead of sit at a table you had every right to sit at." The gate agent's voice crackled overhead, calling final boarding for her flight. Tandy looked toward the jet bridge, then back at him, and for the first time since the video had played that morning, something in her expression cracked open. Not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it, fragile and unguaranteed, waiting to see what he'd do with the next 30 seconds of his life. The gate agent called final boarding a second time. And somewhere behind Thandi the line of passengers thinned to almost nothing. Just her standing at the edge of a decision, and Raphael standing at the edge of a lifetime of assumptions he'd finally run out of road to hide behind. "I'm not asking you to stay because the company needs you," he said. "God knows it survived worse this week alone. I'm asking because I spent 3 years walking past the person my mother loved most in this world, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life being the man who let her get on this plane without at least telling her the truth." "Which is?" Tandy asked quietly. "That you're my sister," he said, and the word came out steadier than he expected, like something finally settling into a shape it had always been meant to hold. "Not because a video said so, because you bled for me without asking for anything back, because you protected a company that never once protected you, because for 3 years you showed this family what loyalty actually looks like, and none of us were paying enough attention to notice we were being taught." The gate agent's voice cut in a final time. "Last call for boarding gate 22. And Thandi glanced toward the jet bridge, boarding pass still gripped tight in one hand. The whole weight of a decided life balanced on a single ordinary moment in an airport terminal. "I didn't do any of it for gratitude," she said. "I know," Raphael said. "That's exactly why you deserve it anyway." She looked at the boarding pass for a long moment. Kigali, a one-way ticket, a life with no strings attached to people who'd spent 3 years mistaking her silence for guilt. And then slowly she folded it in half. Your mother once told me, she said, that family isn't something you're handed. It's something you prove over and over long after anyone's watching. She looked up at him. I think today was the first time this family actually tried. It won't be the last, Raphael said. I promise you that. For the first time since she'd walked into that main hall 3 years ago, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a secret too heavy for one person to hold alone, Tandy let herself believe a Tiongsun's promise without bracing for the moment it would break. The board meeting 3 weeks later was unlike any in Tiongsun Holdings' history. Not because of the fraud charges finally being formalized against Datu Reyes and Uncle Bayani, though that alone would have made headlines for months. It was the first item on the agenda that made history. The formal, legal public recognition of Thandiwe Okafor as a Tiongsun, restored to the family that had once required a dead woman's video confession to admit what should have needed no proof at all. She didn't take a board seat. She didn't want one. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And Raphael had learned in 3 short weeks not to mistake her preference for humility as an absence of power. She chose instead to run the foundation the company had quietly funded for decades without much fanfare, redirecting it toward exactly the kind of humanitarian work that had once, 27 years ago, brought an infant into a stranger's arms in the middle of a crisis she hadn't chosen to be born into. Aunt Ruth, to everyone's mild astonishment, became her most vocal supporter, the particular zeal of someone working overtime to outrun her own shame. Raphael led her. Redemption, his mother had always said, was rarely elegant. It just had to be real. On the estate's west terrace, where the Tiongsun cousins used to sneak cigarettes, and where Thandi had once eavesdropped on family gossip about her own supposed thefts, she and Raphael sat together one evening in the fading gold light, the same light that had lit the courtyard the day everything broke apart, and eventually back together. Do you regret any of it? He asked. The years of silence, the promise you kept even when it cost you everything. Thandi considered the question the way she considered most things, slowly, honestly, without performance. I regret that it took a video to make this family see me, she said. But I don't regret keeping my promise to your mother. She gave me a life I wouldn't have had otherwise. The least I could do was protect the family she loved, even when they didn't deserve it yet. And now? Now? She said. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that plane she never boarded, something like peace settled into her voice. I get to stop proving it. I get to just be it. Below them, the estate hummed with the ordinary sounds of a house finally at rest. No more hidden envelopes, no more forged shares, no more decades-old secrets waiting behind locked doors for a crisis to force them into daylight. Blood had built the Tiongsun dynasty, but it was love, quiet and unglamorous and finally fully spoken, that decided who truly belonged inside it.